The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, earlier this year, the China Daily newspaper, that's one of the propaganda sheets that comes out of Beijing, they had a headline which I thought was very interesting and really germane to our conversation today about Israel. China-Israel ties bloom spectacularly. And, leave it to the editors at China Daily to not go sparing on words there. And they really laid out a litany of all the accomplishments this year and even in previous years leading up to where they think China-Israel ties are today. They highlighted big construction projects like the $1.7 billion port of Haifa, that is run by Shanghai International Port Group. Previously, and this wasn't in the article, there's been a lot of investment by Chinese tech companies, including Alibaba, who were investing heavily in Israel's tech centers in Tel Aviv and setting up R&D centers all around the country. And then Israel also stayed on the sidelines for a long time of a lot of the contentious issues surrounding Xinjiang and China's other territorial issues, which is exactly what Beijing wanted. And for years leading up to 2022, there was always this sense, again, for the past 4 or 5 years, that these are the two oldest continuous civilizations on the planet. They had a lot in common. They were very interested in each other's trade and tech, especially as the Chinese were expanding in the Middle East and in the Arab world, and as Israel's relations were broadening in the Arab world through the Abraham Accords, there was just so much potential. Well, in just the past 6 or 7 months, times have changed a lot. Ties between the two countries have become increasingly frosty. In 2021, just last year, Israel refrained from signing a joint statement led by the French that expressed concern over human rights in Xinjiang. But then just this June, they flip-flopped, and Israel signed a declaration at the UN Human Rights Council denouncing China's actions in Xinjiang. Also in June, Alibaba announced that it was going to close that Israeli R&D center I mentioned, and it laid off all of its 50-member team. And nothing speaks to the deteriorating ties between the two countries more than the incident that occurred back in May when Jerusalem Post editor-in-chief Yaakov Katz interviewed Taiwan's foreign minister Joseph Wu. Not surprisingly, that sent the Chinese ballistic. The day the story was published, a top Chinese diplomat at the embassy in Tel Aviv apparently called Katz, and now I'm going to quote from the Post tweet on the issue, and apparently, according to the Post, threatened to downgrade relations with Israel and sever ties with the Jerusalem Post unless the Post delete an interview. And that's so fascinating because it speaks to the cluelessness that the Chinese have about a free media in a society like Israel's. Again, misunderstanding the role of media. And boy, it really pissed off a lot of people in Israel. And I just want to really get quickly to Katz's reply because it was priceless. And he wrote on Twitter, "I'm supposed to take down the story? Needless to say, the story ain't going anywhere." So that was really interesting. And a lot of this behind the scenes is the U.S. The U.S. was never comfortable with Israel's warming ties with China over the past 10 years and most recently, and has put a lot of pressure on Jerusalem to put some distance with Beijing. And that has really frustrated the Chinese. Axios reported last month that Liu Jianchao, who heads the Chinese Communist Party's International Affairs Department, apparently sent a warning to Israeli ambassador to Beijing, Irit Ben Abba, cautioning him not to be swayed by U.S. pressure or else risk further damage to the relationship. So, Cobus, we have come a long way from just last year. And we did a show earlier this year on China-Israel ties that was a lot more optimistic. We've talked about this in previous shows. We're in a different place right now. And in part, this is what it looks like when countries say they don't want to get caught up in the middle of the spats between the United States and China. This is what it looks like.
Yes, obviously in some respects, Israel is the classic small country kind of caught up in the middle of China, of two superpowers. In some other views, China is, in some other ways, Israel isn't like other small countries at all, in the sense that, it has a special relationship with the United States that brings a lot of protection and a lot of pressures. So I think there's a lot that other countries can learn from how Israel navigates the pressure between the two. But I think there's also a lot that we can unpack on, about China's kind of ambitions in the Middle East and some of the kind of barriers to those ambitions.
Let's get some perspective now from someone who knows this better than almost anybody out there. Alexander Pevzner is an adjunct lecturer at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at Reichman University near Tel Aviv, and he is one of the veterans in the Israel-China watching space. Alex, great to have you on the show for the first time, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Eric and Cobus. You are my heroes for the work that you do, and it's an absolute pleasure to join you.
My goodness, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. We're equal admirers of your work as well. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. We want to talk about the Taiwan issues. We want to talk about Iran, all the pressure from the United States. But I think let's set the stage a little bit here. And I've got a two-part question just to help us frame the discussion. I laid out a bunch of the tensions and the problems. It seems that ties have become frostier and chillier in the past year. Help us understand where we are today in this relationship, and then tell us how we got here.
Right. So the threats of the Chinese DCM in Tel Aviv notwithstanding, relations with Israel have not been downgraded between China and Israel, so we're fine there. Yeah, Chinese diplomats used to be known for their suaveness, but I suppose that's not the case anymore, unfortunately. So you raised a lot of issues. I mean, this is, Israel-China relationship, even though there's such a discrepancy in size, are actually quite multifaceted and very interesting. In Israel, when we talk about the Israel-China relationship, we always talk about the trilateral, Israel-US-China relationship, because the US factor, you simply cannot ignore it. And, the US has been unhappy with Israel's ties with China not for the past decade, but ever more, since the late 90s, actually, going back to the Falcon deal and etc. But I would like to start actually with a bit of history. I know it's not a history podcast, but I think history here is important. Because, just like Cobus mentioned, Israel is a small country, but it's an ally of the U.S. But if you go back, Israel's roots is actually, I don't know if you can call it a global south country, but definitely a socialist country. 1948, when Israel was established, it was, firmly a socialist country, at least in terms of, its relationships, in terms of internal policy, right? Social policies, economic policies. And even though from 48, 49, Israel wanted to build good ties with the U.S., one of the reasons of which was, the U.S. jewelry, which, helped the young state during its establishment. And because Israel, since its founding in May 48, was a democracy. We never experienced, military rule or junta or stuff like that. We were always a democracy. So you can say Israel was on the western side, but nevertheless, because of our founding fathers, like David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, Moshe Sharet, the first foreign minister, they understood the importance of Asia. And you have really early writings by both Ben-Gurion and Sharet saying, we need to build relations with China. We need relations with India because Asia is the future. So that much was always clear. Now, in order to look at the importance of history, I'll quote a recent study. So Pew Research recently did a study, I think it was in July, surveyed views of U.S. and China, of 19 countries, Now, Pew does not always include Israel, unfortunately. So the previous time when Pew included Israel was in 2019. That was before, remember, BC, right? Before Corona, before pandemic. Listen to this. You have to hold on to your chair. A full 66% of Israeli population, 66%, viewed China positively. Okay, that's probably higher than in China. Okay, this is an astounding figure. I mean, it's almost bizarre. So for 3 years we had no surveys, and Pew did surveys, but not in Israel. And we have a new survey from Pew, where it shows that out of 19 countries, right? So most countries see U.S. More favorably, of course, compared with China. And we know that China's standing in the world has, deteriorated in general. But if you look at the Israel numbers, 48% of Israelis view China favorably, and a higher percentage, over 70%, see China's influence is growing. Okay? 48%, and you can say, well, 48% is a big drop compared with 66%, and it's true. And, you probably have to blame COVID for that. But 48% is still the highest of all these 19 countries, with the exception of Malaysia and Singapore, okay, with large, ethnic Chinese populations, right? So 48% positively of Israelis view China positively. That's still a very, very high number. And there are several reasons for that. So first of all, the understanding of Israel that we are in Asia, and we have to be, we have to look at Asia. Secondly, we're lucky that we don't have China as a neighbor. There's, no border issues. We're very different from Southeast Asia or other countries. So no issues there. And, Israelis are pragmatic, but I think, like everyone else, our attention span is very limited. So, the main threat is Iran. The second threat, Iran, okay? And, China may be number 17. So, for us, the main issue is our position in the region, and, you mentioned the Abraham Accords. That's a, very big boost to Israel standing in the region, whereas, Iran's aggressive policies are the main threat. So, for the U.S., China is the main issue. For Israel, it is not. And, there are also issues, you frequently talk in your China-Africa podcast, the Global South podcast, you talk about how China is viewed in other countries. So there are a lot of issues that are a thorn in these bilateral relationships, which absolutely, completely not existent in Israel. So, for example, in some countries, when the Chinese come in to do investment, they bring their own workers, right? Israel has no issue because, Israel is a developed country. Nobody wants to work in construction, okay? We import construction labor, not just from China. By the way, we also have agreements with China. From Romania and from, agriculture workers from Thailand, things like this. So, China is not taking any jobs here, okay? In countries like the US, like Australia, you have the diaspora, right? The Chinese diaspora. And if you have Chinese diaspora, then you have concerns of Chinese undue influence, either like the bribery scandals that in Australian politics, or buying up Chinese language publications like in the US, etc. There's no Chinese diaspora in Israel. So there's no problem. China can influence Israel in very limited ways through high diplomacy, but not, on the ground. So there's a lot of these things that are, kind of disturb China's relationship with other countries, but not so with Israel. And Israeli politics toward China are basically pragmatic. It's not an ideological issue. It never was, and I hope it will never be ideological like it's in the US or in the UK with the new Prime Minister Truss. Even though Israel is a highly advanced country and high tech and startup nation and everything that, we have an enormous backlog of infrastructure. Okay, Israel is, 40 years behind the rest of the world in terms of infrastructure. So Chinese companies coming and building new railway lines or light rail, etc., that's a net win for Israel and China. There's absolutely no problem with that, unless it's, let's say, some project that is close to some, sensitive military installation, which is a separate issue. But, you wouldn't want any other countries to be next to your sensitive military. It's not just a China issue, right?
So, some of the big deals that Eric touched on in the intro started during the Netanyahu administration. So I was wondering what Benjamin Netanyahu was hoping to achieve by this kind of rapid increasing of engagement with China.
That's a very good point. So Netanyahu has visited China in 1998, actually, during his first tenure, but it was not very significant. The real sort of uptick that you and Eric were talking about in China-Israel relations started in 2012, 2013. And that's a combination of several factors. First of all, the new administration, the Obama administration, which, Israel and the U.S., there were issues, let's put it this way, right? The Obama administration said they want to put daylight between them and Israel. So that's one factor. Second of all, in 2012, you have a new guy in charge in China, Xi Jinping, okay? And it's a new leadership level, but it's also a leadership that did not sort of go through the previous difficulties between Israel and China. So, for example, the Falcon deal, okay, the radar system that Israel wanted to sell to China and was stopped by the Americans. So that was Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Xi Jinping sort of wanted to turn on a new slate. Also, take into account that in 2011, I think, there was the new 5-year plan, the 12 5-year plan, which really identified innovation and technology as the new economic development model for China, right? After the global financial crisis, after all the export markets of China dried up. And so the Chinese survey the field and they see Israel, almost untapped, because before 2012, there's not a lot was going on between Israel, almost no tourists, no nothing. So the Netanyahu government saw an opportunity to boost not strategic relations, not political relations, but economic relations with China, okay? And so you see, for example, I remember 2011, we had something like 20,000 Chinese tourists in Israel, something like that. I mean, statistical error. 2019, the last year before the pandemic, we had 160,000, okay, 8-time increase. And that's, the Israeli government worked very hard to invite Chinese airlines to come to Israel. That was a major issue. Israel worked very hard to convince Hainan Airlines and then other airlines to fly to Israel. Visa, ease of getting visa, et cetera, et cetera. And Netanyahu saw an opening, and he wanted, investments to open China for Israeli businesses, but also investments from China. And, I suppose, Netanyahu felt, confident of doing that because, there was nothing positive flowing from the Obama administration. And like I said, there's an opening. So, Israel has its own construction firms, but nothing even coming close to these Chinese giants who, build all over Africa. So, the Chinese companies are very competitive here and, building much, much needed infrastructure. I mean, if you go to Tel Aviv now, all of Tel Aviv is dug up. I mean, simultaneously 5 light rail lines, simultaneously, because that's how bad the situation is. You just have to do everything at the same time.
And are those all being built by the Chinese, or are they being built by various contractors?
Not just the Chinese, of course, but the Chinese are major participants in all infrastructure in Israel, mostly in construction, not in operation, mostly in construction, because this is the Chinese can build fast and with high quality and with, good price.
So if this is the case that, again, construction and there is this solid relationship and there's, again, it's not a primary security concern for the Israelis the way it is for the Americans, then why would Liu Jianchao from the CPC warn the Israeli ambassador about the deterioration of ties, what we've seen with Alibaba, what we've seen with, again, U.S. influence on the Israeli government to put some distance between the two, with the Chinese? Again, I'm trying to get a sense of where we are today. Are we worse off today than we were last year and the years before? Or are these just kind of insignificant little wrinkles in the relationship that every country has with a power like China?
That's a good question. So no doubt that we are worse off, and no doubt the U.S. factor in this triangle is significant, but it's not the only factor. So like I said, there are not so many public spats between Israel and China. You quoted China Daily. If you look at Chinese media, which I do every day, if you look at the bilateral ties, so Israel-China ties are blossoming and everything's fine. You don't see any problems in the Chinese media. Another separate issue, and that's the Palestinians, but that's a separate issue. If you look only at the Israel-China ties. Now, what happened with the U.S. pressure and Liu Jianchao? So I think 2018, 2019, were probably the peak years of Israel-China ties, and has been some cooling since then. But not everything actually is gloomy. Okay, and I'll get to that. But let's see what happens. So first of all, 2013, Netanyahu went to China. Very successful visit. 2017, he went again. Israel and China signed this comprehensive partnership in innovation, which is one of these bumper stickers that China likes to give to its bilateral relationship, which is, an acknowledgement that what China needs from Israel is technology and innovation. And up until 2016, 2017, probably the Obama administration was not particularly happy, but they were not sort of, aggressively unhappy. I mean, Israel, after all, joined the AIIB as a founding member in 2015, So Israel did notify the U.S. that, guys, we're going to join the AIIB. Everything was fine. Now, in comes Trump, and Trump really moves the dial on U.S.-China relationship, and in the process influences everybody else, Israel included. I suspect that Netanyahu, I'm not in the government, I don't have any particular insights, but I suspect that Netanyahu government was hearing what the Trump administration was saying and sort of, marching ahead with our relationship with China. 2018, we had Wang Qishan, Chinese vice president, in Israel for an important visit. This is actually, it's worth dwelling on. So Israel and China has a dialogue, strategic dialogue. It's called the Innovation Summit. Okay, it started 2014. Every year, once in China, once in Israel. So it was on the Israeli side, it was headed by the prime minister, which was Netanyahu all throughout these years. He was in power for like 13 straight years. On the Chinese side, it was the deputy prime minister. Now, China has 4 deputy prime ministers. That was Liu Yandong, the only lady in the Politburo. In 2018, China unilaterally upgraded its representation in this mechanism, okay, and sent Wang Qishan, vice president, who is basically number 8 in the Chinese hierarchy, okay. Israel did not ask for that. It was the Chinese saying, okay, Trump is in town, we have to do something to make Israel not forget about our existence. But, eventually the U.S. pressure started ramping up. You had Pompeo coming here in the middle of the pandemic, warning Israel against Chinese investment. It was, in some areas, it was a little bit overplayed, because the Americans were very concerned about 5G. Even if America did not exist, Israel would not have let Huawei build its 5G. We have no Chinese telecom infrastructure in Israel, not even 4G. Okay, so Huawei was never a concern, but Americans were concerned. But, eventually U.S. pressure kept ramping up. And in 2019, Israel set up a screening mechanism for foreign investment, which Israel did not have previously, which is kind of ridiculous. It's a good idea to have it anyway, not just for China purposes.
And that's like the CFIUS in the United States, right?
Right. It's CFIUS, but it's CFIUS sort of on its in death throes. It's very weak, very, very weak. CFIUS, first of all, the mechanism is voluntary. Secondly, it looks only into infrastructure and not high tech, which is that's the.
But that's weird for an economy like Israel. Isn't that bizarre that it doesn't look in tech?
Yeah, so right. So there was a big internal discussion, first of all, who would lead that, right? Because if the finance people lead that versus the security people leading that, that would bring about a different result. So it's coordinated by the National Security Council, but I think the finance people are more, the stronger part, I think. I think the issue is that high tech is private, all of high tech Israel is just private, you cannot really force them to be regulated. Whereas infrastructure, the government involvement is much heavier. So it's easier. But I'm not excluding the possibility that eventually this will include also technology because of American pressure. But it's not just American pressure. It's also an issue of, Israel and China, we both like to pretend that our relationship is, rosy and there are no issues and everything's hunky-dory. But for years, China, even though it's been, rolling out the carpet for our ministers, government ministers, it's been voting against Israel in the UN in any and every possible forum in the UN. I mean, aggressively anti-Israel. And push came to shove, and Israel just said, "Okay, this is enough." Okay, at a certain stage, Israel said to China, "We want us, if not vote for us in the UN, then at least abstain and not sort of automatically vote against us." There was some improvement, a small improvement, but not a major one. So, Cobus mentioned, and you mentioned the Xinjiang issues. At least in one case, it was not about Xinjiang. It was about getting back at the Chinese for their May 2021 vote against Israel around Gaza, the latest conflagration in Gaza. And, the Chinese, even in May last year, I think China was the president of the Human Rights Council, if I'm not mistaken, and they used this podium to sort of convene a special meeting on Israel and Gaza. So Israel said, okay, we, two can play that game, and voted. So I even made a list of, voting. So June 2021, that was the first time Israel joined the Human Rights Council statement on Xinjiang. We did abstain in October, but then we voted again for a statement in June 2022. So look, to be fair, the Xinjiang issue is not a matter of internal politics in Israel like it is somewhere else in Europe or in the US. But Israel, I think, is still trying to sort of balance a little bit to show China we can vote against them just like they can vote against us.
Can you give us some, while we're on the Xinjiang issue, can you give us a kind of like your impression of how the Xinjiang issue is being discussed internally within Israel? Like how, how are different because of course Israel is such a diverse society with such a broad range of political views. How is the issue being framed in the domestic context of Israel's own issues by Israeli citizens themselves?
That's a very good question. So Xinjiang issue is simply not on the agenda of the mainstream Israeli media. It's not like in the US. This is something what a lot of Americans' friends just don't get it. Doesn't get that play like it gets in Europe. And again, it's not just because Israelis don't care. It's just that it's very far away.
Well, let's be honest that Israel has a very complicated relationship with human rights and Muslim populations. And so this makes it complicated for them to care, because then how is it possible they're seen to be caring about Muslim human rights in China, and yet there's well-documented problems with Israel's behavior in the occupied territories, in the Palestinian areas as well. I mean, that's well-documented.
It's also an issue, right? It's also an issue. I'm not sure this is the only reason. Okay, obviously,
it just makes the optics very complicated for Israel if it took a big stand on this.
Perhaps. Look, even though we're heading for our fifth election in 4 years, unfortunately, our last government, which was the first government in many, many years without Netanyahu, actually had an Arab party in the coalition for the first time since the establishment of the State of Israel. And not any sort of your middle-of-the-road Arab party, but an Islamist party, okay, an Islamist party. We have Arab members in the parliament, we have Arab judges. So, the issue of, the territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, that's as much an Israeli problem as it is an internal Palestinian problem. And, we have to be fair about that. The split in the Palestinian leadership, the consensus, I think most people in Israel would support a certain version of a Palestinian state, but there's also consensus that it's irrelevant under the current Palestinian leadership. I mean, you have a murderous Islamist regime in Gaza, and you have a corrupt Palestinian leadership in Ramallah. It's a bit of a problem. But I have to say, like I said, it's not just about, that we feel uncomfortable. It's just that you want to know how many times Xinjiang is mentioned in Israeli media. first ask how many times China is mentioned in the Israeli media. It's not, like I said, our main sort of concern is Iran and the region, and then the US and Europe, and only then Xinjiang. I haven't seen that, for example, the Xinjiang issue is a problem in the Arabic language media in Israel. It's just the focus is much more.
Well, let's turn our attention to Iran, given that that is a priority for Israel. The Iranian-Chinese relationship is one that, to use the words of China Daily, I think let me go back and seeing it's blooming spectacularly. And I think that applies as well to Tehran-Beijing's ties over the past few years. There was the big $400 billion supermarket deal that everything was flown into it, as part of it. And no one believes that that's going to be a real $400 billion deal. But what it does symbolize, though, is the ambitions for this relationship to grow. Tehran has just joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Tehran sells now about 7% of China's imported oil. Does the relationship between Iran and China make Israel nervous?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you read Israeli media or you talk to Israeli scholars, then, China-Iran is definitely a big thing. Look, the 400 billion was, a pie in the sky. I think we can agree about that. But there's no doubt that the China-Iran relationship is growing. I think you had Jonathan Fulton a while back who was also talking that, China's relationship with the Gulf is much more significant than its relationship with Iran. Iranians also like to play it up, China, as to say, we have an alternative. We don't care about U.S. pressure. But there's no doubt that, let's say, Iran needs China much more than China needs Iran. And China uses Iran as a bit of a boogeyman, okay, to show, all the other Gulf monarchies are U.S. allies, so we're going to develop, as a counterweight, develop relationship with Iran. But Israel is concerned not just about China-Iran relationship. China is more prominent in the Middle East generally. So, for example, you have Chinese arms sales to the region. Okay, drones, for example, to Saudi Arabia, perhaps, and other players. We've even heard that maybe some Chinese drones ended up in the hands of the Houthis in Yemen, who used them then against Saudi Arabia. So I think it's a concern for everybody else. But I think Israel, just like Saudi Arabia, just like Iran, maybe, just like any other country in the region, we understand that China is here to stay. So, you have to, develop a relationship with China. Privately, I suppose, Israel relates its concerns to China about Iran, but it's not in the public sphere as far yet. Now, you mentioned Liu Jianchao. Now, this is very interesting. We have a very, very seasoned, experienced diplomat in China, our ambassador there, Madam Irit Ben Abba. And the way I understand this, the threat component of the don't you dare and, disrupt your ties with us was a little bit overblown, if I may say so.
Well, that was Axios reporting that, and Axios is one of the DC Beltway publications. So there's a lot of incentive for Axios, I think, to hype it up a little bit more maybe than it was.
Also, but the fact is that particular article by Axios was actually written by an Israeli reporter, Barak Ravid, actually, who has excellent sources within the Prime Minister's office. Kudos to him. But, news websites need to, get readership. And if you read the entire article to the end, actually there was a lot of positive things that Liu Jianchao told to Ambassador Ben Abba. I suspect, and this may sound counterintuitive, it had more to do with Taiwan actually than anything else, than anything bilateral between Israel and China. I'll tell you why. First of all, Taiwan is a hot sector and getting hotter, unfortunately, not to the benefit of Taiwan, but it is what it is. And secondly, in April, this was, I don't know if I'm the only one who noticed this, but in April there was a call between Lapid, Prime Minister Lapid, and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And in the Chinese readout, it's usually, the Chinese readouts are usually more detailed than the ones on the Israeli side. Wang Yi talked about the just like China Daily. China's relationship with everyone are blossoming, with Israel, with Iran, with the rest of the world. But then Wang Yi mentioned something. He thanked Israel for its sort of balanced and consistent approach to the Taiwan issue and the consistent one China policy of Israel. So, I think the Chinese have identified that the U.S. pressure on its allies to do more about Taiwan is growing. And I think it's a way for China to warn Israel not to join the crowd. And I think Israel will not join the crowd on the Taiwan issue. I think, at least in the area of one China policy, Israel has been very consistent. It's interesting. If you look at Israel-China-Taiwan ties, then, so Israel was established in May 48. In January 9, 1950, Israel recognized China, the People's Republic of China. The first country in the Middle East, the seventh non-communist country to recognize the People's Republic of China. That was in January 1950. Before that, in March 49, the Republic of China, that is now on Taiwan, but in March 49, Republic of China, the government of the Republic of China, was still controlling the mainland, recognized the young country, the young state of Israel. But Israel, like I said, the founding fathers of Israel, looked at China, did not reciprocate. So Israel, unlike the U.S., for example, never recognized Taiwan, never recognized the Republic of China. So in January 1950, Israel recognized the People's Republic of China. So I think it has more to do with, both bilateral ties, but also Taiwan.
Shifting back to the relationship between the United States and Israel, how do you foresee, internal U.S. domestic dynamics kind of impacting on this relationship? Would there be any kind of significant change if, say, there's a shift to the Republicans, particularly, kind of a quite right-wing Republican candidate in 2024, on Israel's relationship with China? Or is there such a kind of level of unification across the aisle at the moment in the US that kind of internal shift doesn't matter so much in this case?
So I'm not going to be so crazy to try to analyze US politics. I'll leave it for braver souls. But I think U.S. policy towards China is probably set out in stone. You guys and everyone who's following this issue closely know that there are different voices in the U.S. when it comes to China. There's a lot of criticism, but I think Congress is, dead set against China, and this will drive the direction of policy, of U.S. policy towards China. I don't see a change if a Republican administration comes to power. Maybe if the change will be more in a negative, towards more aggressive posture towards China. So I don't think the pressure, the U.S. pressure on Israel to sort of lower the temperature of its relationship with China will change. But I think this is actually it's an opportunity to raise another aspect. So, we talked about the U.S. pressure on Israel, but that's not unique, right? The U.S. is pressuring all of its allies. What is different specifically, and another contributing factor to the fact that, for example, Israel signed on that declaration on Xinjiang, is the new government in Israel. So even though it has already collapsed and we another elections, but nevertheless there was a big change because the previous Prime Minister Netanyahu was seen as very, very, very close to the Republican circles in the U.S. He and Trump were very close, and so this government led by Bennett and Lapid actually set out, and quite regardless of China, set out from the beginning to repair the bilateral support of Israel in the U.S. And that if that was, in order to repair that, to work better with the Democrats, not to put all of our eggs in one basket. And if that means sort of putting a lid to our relationship with China, then this is the price to pay. So it was also sort of internal Israeli considerations, quite unrelated to the ties with China. But by the way, it's not all gloomy, like I said. So, for example, last week, September 8th, Israel and China had their fourth or fifth bilateral dialogue. And one of the things on the agenda was the free trade agreement. So Israel has been negotiating for the past, I think, 6 years, negotiating a free trade agreement with China. And there's a very good chance that this will be signed this year. Now, this is a big thing because, first of all, China itself does not have a lot of free trade agreements, by the way. This is interesting to note. And the current Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, specifically mentioned the free trade agreement with Israel in his address after the 2 sessions, I think, last year. But for Israel, it's also very important because so far we have a free trade agreement with only one country in Asia, and that's South Korea. So this is a big thing for Israel to sign. Now, the question is how it will be presented. Okay, so will Israel just go and sign a free trade agreement with China? You know, people in DC will have heart attacks. Perhaps it will be dressed up. Because Israel, there's a talk of Israel-Vietnam free trade deal. I don't think the negotiation is such an advanced state, but there is talk about this. So perhaps it can be presented as a package. Okay, Israel is signing free trade with China and Vietnam. Maybe this will be more, palatable in Washington.
Unlikely, I imagine. I think they'll see right through that for a second. Listen, you've given me a taste of my own medicine here because one of the things that I do when I speak to students and to groups about China and Africa and China and the global south is I always say I want to leave you more confused than when we start, because a lot of people come in with these binary narratives, good, bad. They've got all their minds made up, and to some extent, you've muddled the water for me in a big way. I can't really tell where we are, and again, that's a good thing because I think again it shows how complex this relationship is. But let's close our discussion just trying to give us a little bit of a forecast of where you think things are going in the near term. On the one hand, I'm hearing from you lots of big problems at the UN, lots of big concerns about Iran, pressure from the United States, real problems in the relationship, okay? Meddling into civil society, again, with the Jerusalem Post, that really upset quite a few people. You and I were in Israel together, and we spoke to a number of people who really were put off by that. At the same time, again, this is not a primary security relationship for the Israelis. There's a lot of economic benefit, a lot of trade potential that's there, and a lot of opportunities. So I'm confused again, but that's a good thing. I say that complimentarily. Where are we and where are we going? That's basically where we started the conversation.
Based on my conversations with the Israeli policymakers, as much as I can have them, Israel is very clear that the U.S.-China relationship is going down fast. And this is the trend of our times, and no reversal is expected. And I think Israeli policymakers are also very clear, rightly so, that Israel's primary relationship is with the United States. Security-wise, diplomatically-wise, this is our main strategic relationship, even though, by the way, our main trading partner is the European Union and not the U.S., but nevertheless.
And there's a deep cultural relationship as well, people-to-people ties.
Right. There's deep cultural thing. And, President Biden visited Israel in July, I think. And, Israel and the U.S. launched U.S.-Israel Strategic High-Level Dialogue on Technology, okay, which includes all the goodies that China would like to have, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, even climate change. So this is also a way. This is very early days. The statement was just put out, and now you have to flesh it out and set up working teams in every area. But this is one way of the U.S. to sort of pull away the Israeli technological sector, which is formidable, away from China. On the other hand, like the dialogue on free trade agreement shows, that Israel, just like any other country in the world, with the exception of very, very few cases, does not want to give up its economic ties with China. And there's really no reason to, provided that you can, control the risks, minimize the risks, not do crazy stuff, not, do stuff on 5G. Then, the problem is it's not such a big issue, and there's no reason. Nobody else is giving up its, their trading ties with China. Why would Israel? So I think we will continue, leaning to the U.S., but having our foot also on the Chinese side too. So this is actually interesting because I think if the current government would have stayed in power, I think they would probably be less cynical, and I think the connection with the U.S. would be better. I have no idea what will happen come November. Okay, fifth election in 4 years. If Netanyahu comes back, which looks pretty solid if you look at the polls, maybe Netanyahu will go back to the relationship with China as it used to be. That's a very big question, but really, Israeli politics are harder to predict than U.S. politics even, so I'm not going to try.
Well, we could see a day where we have Netanyahu and Trump back in power again. My goodness.
Yes. Brace yourself.
Alexander Pevzner is an adjunct lecturer at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at Reichman University near Tel Aviv. And he's always one of the smartest guys in the room on Israel-China affairs. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us and for taking the time to kind of walk us through and confusing us. Again, that's a wonderful thing. If people want to follow what you're reading and writing these days, what's the best way for them to stay in touch with you?
So thank you for having me. Eric Cobus, you know I'm a TikTok sensation, right?
Yes, you look like a TikToker.
Exactly. No, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not on TikTok, but I'm everywhere else, I suppose.
Okay. And what's your Twitter handle if people want to follow you?
AB Pevzner. AB Pevzner on Twitter, and LinkedIn, just my name.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put links to all of those in the show notes. Once again, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Cobus, what a treat for us to be able to speak with Alex, someone with his experience, his perspective. Again, it's interesting to look at Israel and compare it to other small countries. And on the one hand, as you pointed out, yes, Israel is indeed a small country by any measures, geographically, population-wise, okay. But it is not a small country in the classic definition. It's a very, very powerful small country. So the comparisons between, say, Uganda and Israel are, that's strained at best. However, I'm curious to hear from you. What did you hear in the discussion with Alex that resonated with you in terms of the dilemma that a country like Israel has in its relations with China and managing its relations with the United States and those, say, in South Africa or other African countries?
Well, I guess, the one big issue is that like these other countries, I think, kind of compared to African countries, Israel has a lot more options. But I think one thing that is similar is that in a lot of ways, all of these different kind of development and economic growth priorities have to be filtered through a kind of a geopolitical calculus. So obviously Israel has a big tech sector, China has a big demand for tech, like across a whole bunch of different fields, plus China also has a lot of opportunities to invest in high level tech. A lot of those options have to be kind of like taken off the table, kind of because of geopolitical concerns. And we see very similar kind of issues involved in many African countries, frequently on a much lower level, but like around internet provision, for example. So it's not a situation where these countries can simply look for the best deal and then move ahead. Kind of they have to, like these kind of what are in theory domestic development decisions end up having to be kind of reworked through a kind of a global geopolitical calculus.
I also think there's an opportunity for smaller developing countries who, again, haven't always found their footing in terms of the framing and the language to use in order to push back against all of the major powers, the Chinese, the Europeans, the Americans, and to some extent even the Russians. And the Israelis in many ways have a confidence that they've been able to do that, in part because of their very close relationship with both Europe and the United States. And so there might be an opportunity here to take some of the framing that Alex had and to bring that into, say, African or Middle Eastern or South American foreign ministries. For example, this idea that, again, don't make us choose. We're not going to sacrifice our economic relationship with China. Nobody would do that. That's crazy, okay? The way that he framed that, I thought that was very interesting. The other part is how the Israelis have welcomed in Chinese infrastructure builders and Chinese infrastructure contractors. And one has to think that if the United States was truly good at building infrastructure around the world, they would be competitive in Israel. And the fact that they're not competitive in Israel, to me, is really quite a sign. Okay, it's one thing not to be competitive in the DRC and Nigeria and frontier markets, or even here in Vietnam. It's another thing not to be competitive in Israel. And so that kind of took me by surprise that if the Americans with their whole PGII, B3W, whatever the acronym of the day is, want to compete in places like the Global South, and the fact that they're not even doing it in Israel, that kind of got me thinking a little bit. I don't know. But anyway, back to this question of the framing. It does strike me as there might be an opportunity to take some of the language and the structuring of the policy that the Israelis are doing and to bring it, at least parts of it, into other Global South, or at least Global South foreign ministries in their positioning in the great power rivalry.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, kind of one of the things that I think plays interestingly into this issue is the kind of broader issue of kind of anti-Westernism, because we've seen that, around the Ukraine crisis, around the way kind of Chinese messaging in the Global South, they frequently do lean into a kind of a anti-Western animus, kind of even like frequently those like in Africa, particularly that particular kind of view of viewing the West comes from a colonial history, a kind of a post-colonial new imperial history, and general kind of pressure from Western institutions that kind of lead to a lot of resentment. And China knows that and leans into it. I think Israel is this interesting kind of like other example, or like example of a kind of a Global South country and an Asian country where the kind of connections, the media connections and discourse connections to North America and Europe are much stronger than in most Global South countries. So there it becomes this interesting test case in terms of how talking points and kind of like discourse power struggles between China and the US looks, kind of like in the Global South, but from a kind of from a very kind of from the perspective of a very specific kind of non-West relationship. So there I think there's a lot to learn there in terms of how this kind of messaging and counter messaging works. Kind of if you want to see the success and failure of US versus Chinese messaging in a particular kind of non-Western society, Israel becomes this interesting kind of counterfactual kind of test case, that stands in quite sharp contrast with many other Global South countries.
Let's focus on 2 points going forward, at least for the next 6 to 9 months. One is the apparent collapse of the JCPOA, that is the Iran nuclear talks. China's been involved in that. Obviously, that's a major concern to Israel. That is a security priority number one for the Israelis. That's going to be very interesting to watch the Chinese and how they manage this. And again, that China-Iran axis and that relationship is very important to Israel. And then, of course, we have a change in government incoming in Israel again. What's that going to do for the China relationship? Probably not too much. But we also have to keep an eye on China's expanding footprint in the Middle East and how that may make the Israelis nervous. But at the same time, the Israelis, too, are expanding their presence in the Middle East through the Abraham Accords. There's now new direct flights to Saudi Arabia, inconceivable a few years ago. And obviously, the United Arab Emirates sits in the middle of all this. So let's just kind of wrap it up, Cobus, in terms of where you think this relationship is going. And in terms of China's broader presence in the Middle East, how significant do you think Israel's going to be going forward in the next year or so?
I mean, Israel is always going to be significant, among others because of its complexities and because it is this kind of, has such a strong, like fundamentally strong kind of connection to the United States. But I think it will also, the interactions between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel in the region, and the way that China tries to kind of play into that may well, they'll definitely be important, but I wonder if they might also end up limiting Chinese influence there. Simply because China is such a newcomer to the area, it's beyond trade. China doesn't necessarily bring that much to the table. Kind of compared to it won't play the kind of security role that the United States is playing in the region, for example. So I think at the moment, particularly in relation to oil trade, it's a really kind of red hot kind of area. Once the influence of oil starts kind of dissipating because of climate mitigation, kind of over the next 20 years or so, some of that might fade, and then we're looking probably at a completely different kind of calculus about, kind of in the region in relation to Chinese power.
Okay, let's leave the conversation there. If this is an issue that you are interested in, I highly recommend that you follow Alex's Twitter feed. Also, I'm going to put a link to Tuvia Gering's Twitter feed. He's at the think tank INSS in Jerusalem as well, an excellent Israel-China scholar. This is a topic we follow very closely in our daily coverage in the newsletter, especially how Israel's relationship with China and the broader Middle East kind of play in that dynamic. So fascinating. It's so complicated and confusing. I wasn't joking when I said I'm leaving the conversation with Alex more confused than when I started. That's a healthy place to be because these are incredibly complicated relationships that can't be boiled down into simple, well, is it good or is it bad? So we like the fact that if you're confused and I'm confused, that's a good place to be because there's a lot of complexity in this relationship. So we'll be back again next week with another episode. Again, this is the first few episodes of this new China Global South podcast. For regular listeners of our Africa podcast, the format is very similar. The dynamic is very similar. The topics are more broad, but we would love to hear what you think. Give us any feedback. You can reach me at eric@chinaafricaproject.com or Cobus @chinaafricaproject.com. We would love to get your feedback, good, bad, and ugly, by the way. All of it is welcome. And also, again, if you'd like to subscribe to the work that we're all doing, we have a team of 9 editors now around the world who are putting together these amazing reports in Arabic, in French, and also in English. Sign up at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. That'll do it. We'll be back again next week. For Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thanks for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.